While defending his immigration policy, Donald Trump suddenly took aim at the UK and quipped, "Deport the Royal Guard, too." The audience chuckled. Everyone except one man, a Royal Guard, quietly seated in his uniform, rose to his feet. He didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He simply asked if honoring sacrifice in silence is a crime. "Should we begin at Arlington?" The room went dead quiet. Trump's expression dropped, and for the first time that day, he had nothing to say. Before we show you what unfolded next, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. September 15th, 2025, marked a day that would forever change how the world viewed the relationship between military honor and political power. Washington, D.C. buzzed with the energy of international diplomacy as world leaders converged on the Walter E. Washington Convention Center for what was being called the most significant global security summit in decades. The autumn air carried a crispness that seemed to sharpen the tension already building beneath the surface of carefully orchestrated diplomatic protocols. The American capital had transformed overnight into a fortress of security, with motorcades weaving through streets lined with barriers and checkpoints. Among the arriving dignitaries, Donald Trump's presence commanded immediate attention, his characteristic confidence evident as he emerged from his armored vehicle, flanked by an entourage that moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The 47th President of the United States had returned to office, with promises to reshape America's place on the global stage, and this summit represented his first major opportunity to demonstrate that vision to the world. Yet it wasn't the American delegation that drew the most curious glances from early rivals. Positioned strategically throughout the convention center's main entrance stood 6 members of Britain's elite Royal Guard, their crimson tunics and imposing burskin hats creating a striking tableau against the backdrop of contemporary architecture. These soldiers represented more than ceremonial tradition. They embodied centuries of military heritage and unwavering dedication to duty, selected specifically to demonstrate Britain's commitment to strengthening international security partnerships. Within their ranks stood Lance Sergeant Tobias Hart, a 28-year-old career soldier whose service record spoke of exceptional dedication and sacrifice. His military journey had taken him through the dusty landscapes of Afghanistan and the volatile regions of Iraq, experiences that had forged him into the kind of soldier who understood the true weight of uniform and duty. Hidden within his perfectly pressed uniform lay a document that would soon change everything, a sealed authorization from his commanding officer that granted him unprecedented permission to break the sacred silence of ceremonial duty under extraordinary circumstances. The morning hours passed with the measured rhythm of international diplomacy, world leaders engaging in the careful dance of statecraft. While Hart maintained his motionless vigil, his trained awareness absorbed every detail of the unfolding proceedings, but his thoughts inevitably drifted to memories that continued to define his understanding of service and sacrifice. The weight of personal loss had shaped Hart's perspective in ways that few could understand. 3 years earlier, while standing guard at a similar state function, he had received the devastating news that would forever alter his life's trajectory. His younger brother, Private Marcus Hart, had been killed in action near Kabul, the victim of an improvised explosive device that ended a life full of promise. At just 19 years of age, Marcus had enlisted with the same sense of duty that ran through their family's bloodline, eager to serve alongside the international coalition forces working to bring stability to a war-torn region. The funeral at Arlington National Cemetery remained etched in Hart's memory with crystalline clarity. Section 7. Plot 42 coordinates that had become as familiar to him as his own address. The ceremony had unfolded with military precision, each ritual performed with the solemnity that such occasions demanded. Hart had stood at attention for 12 consecutive hours that day, his grief held in check by the same discipline that now kept him motionless. In the face of international scrutiny, the flag that had covered his brother's coffin now rested in a place of honor in his London flat, a daily reminder of the cost of freedom and the fragility of life. As the summit's morning sessions progressed, Hart observed the ebb and flow of diplomatic interactions with the detached professionalism that defined his service. Delegates moved through the halls in clusters, their conversations punctuated by the subtle body language of international relations. The British contingent maintained their characteristic diplomatic reserve, while their American counterparts displayed the confident assertiveness that had become their trademark in recent years. The lunch recess brought a temporary lull to the formal proceedings. but the royal guards remained steadfast at their appointed stations. It was during this quieter interval that Hart first sensed the subtle shift in atmosphere. That experienced soldiers learned to recognize the indefinable change in energy that precedes significant events. American delegates had begun clustering in small groups, their animated conversations occasionally punctuated by glances toward the British ceremonial guards. President Trump emerged from the main conference hall with his entourage, his presence immediately commanding attention from the assembled crowd. His stride carried the confidence of a leader accustomed to being the focal point of any gathering, and his eyes seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings with the calculating awareness of a seasoned political operative. When his gaze settled on the motionless guards, something in his expression shifted, a familiar look that those who knew him recognized as the prelude to one of his spontaneous moments. The transformation that followed would be dissected by political analysts and historians for years to come, but in the moment, it unfolded with the seemingly casual spontaneity that had become Trump's signature style. He approached the guards with the easy confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation he couldn't dominate through sheer force of personality, his voice carrying clearly across the marble expanse of the convention center's main foyer. "Look at these guys," Trump declared to his assembled entourage, his tone mixing mock admiration with barely concealed derision. "Standing there like mannequins in a department store window. You know what? Maybe we should ship them all back where they came from, make some room for real Americans who actually move when they're supposed to." The comment ignited immediate laughter from the American delegation, a chorus of approval that echoed off the polished surfaces surrounding them. The jest embodied Trump's characteristic blend of provocative humor and divisive rhetoric, designed to simultaneously entertain his supporters while challenging his opponents. It was precisely the kind of spontaneous, controversial moment that had defined his political career and kept him at the center of global attention. The British diplomatic staff maintained their professional composure, their training preventing any visible reaction to what was clearly intended as a calculated provocation. Years of experience in international relations had prepared them for such moments, and their silence spoke volumes about the discipline required in high-stakes diplomacy. But something was stirring beneath the surface of ceremonial protocol, something that would soon shatter the carefully maintained facade of diplomatic civility. Hart felt the comment strike him like a physical blow, penetrating layers of professional detachment and military discipline to reach something fundamental and unbreakable within his core. His hand moved almost unconsciously toward the sealed envelope hidden within his uniform, his fingers tracing the edges of the document that represented an unprecedented break from centuries of tradition. The authorization it contained had been granted in recognition of changing times and the need for soldiers to defend not just physical territory, but the honor and memory of their fallen comrades. The laughter continued to ripple through the assembled crowd, growing louder as more delegates joined in the apparent amusement. Trump basked in the attention with practiced ease, clearly enjoying the spotlight as cameras began to focus on what appeared to be another spontaneous moment of presidential commentary. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across every conceivable media platform, analyzed by experts and ordinary citizens alike, who struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Hart stepped forward with deliberate precision, a movement so subtle that most observers initially failed to register its significance. Then, with movements that seemed to unfold in slow motion, he reached up and removed his bearskin hat, revealing his face to the assembled crowd for the first time since assuming his ceremonial post. The symbolic weight of this action resonated immediately throughout the hall. Anyone familiar with Royal Guard protocol understood that the ceremonial headwear was never removed during duty hours, never abandoned except under the most extraordinary circumstances. The breach of protocol sent ripples of surprise through the crowd, conversations dying mid-sentence as delegates turned to witness this unprecedented violation of military tradition. Hart's face, now visible to the assembled dignitaries, bore the composed expression of a man who had made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. His features carried the weathered appearance of someone who had seen combat, but his eyes held a clarity and determination that commanded immediate attention. When he spoke, his Yorkshire accent cut through the sudden silence with the precision of a blade through silk. "Mr. President," Hart said, his voice maintaining the calm professionalism of his military training, while carrying an underlying current that made seasoned officers throughout the room unconsciously straighten their posture. "Shall we begin those deportations at Arlington National Cemetery?" The question hung in the air like the aftermath of an explosion, its implications spreading through the consciousness of everyone present with devastating clarity. Trump's confident smile began to falter as he processed the soldier's words, confusion replacing amusement as the meaning became clear. Arlington, America's most sacred burial ground, where over 400,000 service members from every American conflict lay beneath rows of pristine white marble headstones. Hart continued with the same measured calm, his voice never rising but somehow filling every corner of the vast space. My younger brother rests in Section 7, Plot 42. Private Marcus Hart, 19 years old when an improvised explosive device ended his service to the coalition forces in Afghanistan. Would you prefer to exhume his remains first, sir? Or shall we start with someone else's son? The effect of Hart's words was immediate and devastating, creating a silence so profound that the ambient sounds of the convention center air conditioning, distant traffic, the hum of electronic equipment became suddenly, unnaturally audible. Several people in the assembled crowd audibly gasped, the sharp intake of breath creating a sound like wind through cemetery grounds. A British diplomat's fountain pen slipped from nerveless fingers, its clatter against the marble floor echoing with disproportionate loudness in the stunned quiet. Trump's expression underwent a transformation that would be studied by body language experts and political commentators for months to come. The confident smirk that had defined the moment dissolved into something approaching bewilderment, then recognition, then what could only be described as the dawning awareness of having stepped into territory far more treacherous than anticipated. His mouth opened as if to respond, but no sound emerged, perhaps the first time in his public career that the man known for his rapid-fire comebacks found himself completely speechless. Hart's commitment to his unprecedented course of action remained absolute. 3 years of accumulated grief, of standing silent while politicians reduced military sacrifice to talking points and campaign rhetoric, had finally found expression through a voice that refused to be silenced by protocol or convention. Private Hart received full military honors at his burial, Mr. President, the same honors accorded to every American service member who makes the ultimate sacrifice in service to freedom. Perhaps you would be so kind as to explain to his headstone why that service wasn't quite American enough for your standards. The transformation rippling through the assembled crowd was palpable, like watching the moment when a tide reaches its turning point. What had begun as a casual moment of political theater had evolved into something far more significant, a confrontation between power and principle that transcended national boundaries and political affiliations. The cameras that had initially focused on capturing another Trump controversy were now documenting something entirely unprecedented. The most powerful person on earth, being held accountable by a single soldier, armed with nothing more than moral authority and unshakable conviction. Then, from across the room, a figure in uniform began to rise with deliberate solemnity. General Patricia Williams, the United States Army's highest-ranking African-American woman, stood slowly from her position at the American delegation table, her movement carrying the weight of 3 decades of military service and personal understanding of sacrifice. Her hand moved to her forehead in a crisp, perfectly executed salute directed unmistakably toward the young British soldier who had just spoken truth to power. General Williams's salute created a moment of recognition that spread through the assembled military personnel like electricity through water. One by one, uniformed officers from multiple nations began to stand. A French colonel whose unit had served in the Saal, a German brigadier general who had lost soldiers in Syria, a Canadian major whose forces had worked alongside British troops in Iraq. Within moments, dozens of military representatives from across the international community were on their feet, their synchronized salutes creating a forest of raised hands. In a space designed for diplomatic discourse rather than military tribute, the civilians present found themselves witnessing something they had never seen before and might never see again. Soldiers from different countries, different cultures, different languages, united in their recognition of fundamental truths about duty, sacrifice, and respect that transcended political boundaries. The display was neither planned nor coordinated, yet it possessed a power and authenticity that no amount of careful choreography could have achieved. Trump remained seated at the center of this expanding circle of military solidarity, his usual commanding presence diminished by the simple moral authority wielded by a young soldier, speaking for his fallen brother. The political instincts that had carried him through decades of public life seemed to have completely abandoned him in the face of a situation that couldn't be spun, controlled, or dominated through conventional means. Hart maintained his position, at attention throughout this extraordinary display, his training preventing him from acknowledging the salutes even as his peripheral vision registered every raised hand in the room. The weight of what he had done was beginning to settle on his shoulders. He had shattered the sacred silence of the Royal Guard, violated centuries of protocol, and transformed an international diplomatic summit into an impromptu moment of military remembrance. Yet as he stood there, feeling the solidarity of his fellow service members washing over him like an incoming tide, Hart understood that some protocols were meant to be broken when greater principles were at stake. Some silences needed to be shattered when truth demanded a voice. Some traditions, no matter how ancient or revered, must yield to the higher calling of honor and remembrance. The moment stretched across time with an intensity that made seconds feel like minutes, creating a tableau that would be remembered long after the specific details of the summit's official proceedings had faded from memory. Finally, General Williams broke the spell by slowly lowering her salute and addressing the room in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for American military values. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her words cutting through the profound silence with the clarity of a bell, "I believe we should take an immediate recess to reflect on exactly why we have all gathered here today, and what we truly owe to those who have paid the ultimate price for our freedom." To conduct these discussions, her eyes found Trumps across the room, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, the two most powerful Americans present engaged in a silent exchange that needed no words to convey its meaning. The spell was broken, but the impact would resonate far beyond the walls of the convention center. As delegates began to file out for the impromptu recess, the hall erupted in hushed, urgent conversations. Smartphones appeared as if by magic, fingers flying across screens as news of the confrontation began to spread beyond the immediate witnesses. Social media platforms would explode within the hour, but for now, the story belonged exclusively to those who had experienced it firsthand. Hart carefully replaced his bearskin hat and resumed his ceremonial position, but everything had fundamentally changed. The delegates and tourists who passed his station now did so with a markedly different awareness, a recognition that they were in the presence of someone who had just altered the course of history. Through 3 minutes of carefully chosen words, children pointed and whispered to their parents, while veterans in the crowd offered subtle nods of respect as they walked past his post. The afternoon sessions resumed with an atmosphere that bore no resemblance to the morning's proceedings. Trump returned to the conference hall, but his characteristic bravado had been replaced by an uncharacteristic quietness that his advisors found deeply unsettling. The viral moment was already beginning to spread across global media networks, with hastily recorded cell phone videos accumulating millions of views. As the story spread across continents, Colonel James Morrison, Hart's commanding officer, arrived at the convention center within 2 hours of receiving word about the incident that had shattered decades of ceremonial protocol. Morrison was a 30-year military veteran who had spent his career navigating the delicate balance between military tradition and political reality, but he had never encountered a situation that even remotely resembled what had unfolded in Washington that day. "Lance Sergeant Hart," Morrison said quietly as he approached the soldier's position, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the continuing summit activities. "We need to have a private conversation immediately." For the first time since dawn, Hart broke his ceremonial stance, following his superior officer to a secure room that had been hastily arranged by British diplomatic security personnel. The conversation that took place behind those closed doors would remain classified for years to come, but witnesses reported seeing Morrison emerge 30 minutes later wearing an expression that seemed to blend pride, concern, and something that looked remarkably like profound admiration. Meanwhile, the story was exploding across every conceivable media platform with the velocity that only truly significant events can achieve. CNN, BBC, Fox News, Sky News, and dozens of other international outlets were providing continuous coverage of what commentators were already calling the Arlington confrontation. Political analysts struggled to find historical precedents for what they had witnessed, debating whether it represented an unprecedented breach of military protocol, a moment of justified moral courage, or something else entirely that defied easy categorization. The hashtags #Arlington moment, #RespectFigured, and #NeverForget began trending worldwide within 3 hours of the confrontation, generating millions of posts, comments, and shares from people across the globe who felt compelled to weigh in on what they had witnessed. Veterans organizations issued carefully worded statements of support, while political commentators engaged in heated debates about the implications of a foreign soldier publicly challenging an American president on American soil. The complexity of the situation defied simple analysis, which only intensified the public discussion and media coverage. This wasn't merely a diplomatic incident or a breach of protocol. It had evolved into a global conversation about respect, sacrifice, and the relationship between military service and political power that transcended national boundaries and partisan divisions. As the summit's official proceedings drew to their scheduled conclusion, the reverberations from Hart's confrontation continued to spread through political, military, and social circles round the world with the inexorable force of a natural phenomenon. News analysis programs devoted entire segments to examining the implications of what had transpired, featuring retired generals, political scientists, international relations experts, and military historians who offered their perspectives on a moment that seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about protocol, authority, and moral courage. The story had transcended its origins as a diplomatic incident and evolved into something much larger and more significant, a global conversation about the relationship between those who serve in uniform and those who wield political power. Opinion writers and editorial boards struggled to capture the full significance of a moment when a single soldier had managed to silence the most powerful person on earth, with nothing more than a reference to his brother's grave and the principles that grave represented. Hart's personal background began to emerge through careful investigative reporting by journalists who spoke with former colleagues, examined military records, and traveled to his Yorkshire hometown to interview residents who had watched him grow up. The picture that emerged was of a young man who had chosen military service, not from economic necessity or limited options, but from a genuine sense of duty and family tradition that stretched back generations. His father had served during the Falklands conflict. His grandfather had fought in World War II, creating a legacy of service that gave additional weight and context to his unprecedented actions. The international military community's response proved to be perhaps the most telling aspect of the entire affair. Service members from dozens of countries took to social media platforms to share their own stories of loss, sacrifice, and the often painful disconnect between political rhetoric and the reality of military service. What had begun as one man's moment of moral courage had sparked a global conversation about the true cost of freedom and the respect owed to those who pay that price with their lives. When Trump's official response finally came, nearly 6 hours after the confrontation, it was notably restrained by his usual standards. The carefully crafted statement acknowledged the sacrifice of all service members, while stopping short of a direct apology for his initial comments. Political observers noted the unusual measured tone of his language, interpreting it as evidence that even he recognized the moral authority that Hart had wielded during their brief but devastating encounter. 5 days after the summit concluded, Hart was quietly reassigned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace, in what was officially described as a routine rotation, but understood by everyone involved as a strategic move to remove him from the intense international media spotlight, while the political ramifications of his actions continued to unfold across global political landscapes. His return to London was met by crowds of supporters who had gathered to demonstrate their appreciation for his courage, but Hart himself remained bound by military protocol that prevented him from making any public statements about the events in Washington. The long-term consequences of what media outlets had dubbed the Arlington moment continued to ripple through international relations, military culture, and political discourse for months after the summit ended. Diplomatic historians would later identify it as a pivotal moment in the evolution of civil-military relations, a time when traditional boundaries between ceremonial duty and moral obligation were challenged and ultimately redefined by the demands of conscience and honor. For Hart personally, the aftermath brought both international recognition and the heavy burden of knowing that his 3 minutes of speech had forever altered his relationship with the institution he had sworn to serve. The Royal Guard would never be quite the same, carrying forward the knowledge that even the most sacred traditions must sometimes yield to higher principles when history demands a response to moral challenges. Military academies around the world began incorporating the incident into their ethics curricula, using it as a case study in the complex relationship between duty, protocol, and personal conscience. The moment when a young soldier chose to speak for his fallen brother became a touchstone for discussions about the responsibilities that come with wearing a uniform, and the courage required to uphold the values that uniform represents. Years would pass before the full impact of Hart's actions could be properly assessed. But one immediate result was undeniable. The grove surrounding Section 7, Plot 42 at Arlington National Cemetery began receiving a steady stream of visitors who came specifically to pay their respects to Private Marcus Hart. They came not just to honor one fallen soldier, but to acknowledge the brother who had refused to allow his memory to be diminished by political theater. In the end, perhaps that proved to be the most fitting tribute of all, ensuring that sacrifice is remembered with the dignity it deserves, regardless of the political cost of speaking such fundamental truths.